Hi, I'm so glad that you guys could all join us. It looks like we have quite a few people in the room today, and we are so excited to provide you with this chat. I think you guys are going to love it, hopefully. And what we're going to do to get started, my name is Betsy Lozega. I am joined today by Dr. Laura Kern. Can you say hi, Laura? I want to make sure I can hear you.
Hi.
So she and I are multiple states away from each other, I think, today, but it should sound like we're just all in the same room.
Hello, everyone. So when we were thinking about how we're going to do this presentation, we didn't want it just to be here's a research study, here's a research study, here's a research study. So we're going to kind of go over the overall outcome type of what PBIS does it work? But then we also wanted to look at some of the myths and misconceptions about PBIS and how to sort of answer that, address that in your districts with kind of research responses. And then a couple of takeaways on how you can have conversations about research and different perspectives with people within the districts. So overall, we're going to identify the common questions, objections, and myths surrounding PBIS implementation, and also some of the bigger research, examine some of that research that dispels the myths, and then investigate ways to build that common understanding and provide resources for you. Okay, Betsy, can you get to the next slide? So do we have positive outcomes for PBIS? And the big picture right now is yes, we have like really strong positive outcomes. We're now looking at randomized control trials, which are sort of our gold standard for research that's saying that PBIS is working on the school-wide level for all sorts of outcomes. We're now starting to have-
So I just have to sit, I've got things to do.
Like meta-analyses, which is basically like where we look at different research studies and say across all these studies, do they work? So we're getting some really strong outcomes. And this has only been in about the last 10 years that we can have really strong research, because beforehand, we really were starting kind of from scratch. We were taking from all different areas, putting it together, and coming up with sort of studies along the way that prove that different parts were working. But now we're 20 years in, so about 10 years ago, we really started to have a lot more stronger research studies that showed that, yes, we are having some strong impact. So overall, Dr. George came up with this wonderful slide on outcomes a couple of years ago when she did a keynote speech. And we just love this slide because it really shows really strong outcomes that we have across student, exclusionary discipline, and on our teacher outcomes. So in our student outcomes, we now know we have stronger academics, we have better social emotional competence, we have combined social and academic, so getting a little bit more into that traditional MTSS. We don't have an illustration of this, but we know it works across all different levels. Preschool has a little bit of modification, but they use a school-wide PBIS. We know it works in elementary, middle, high school. We have reduced bullying behaviors, which is great. And we also have decreased rates of student-reported drug and alcohol abuse. We also have reduced exclusionary discipline, and a lot of times this is kind of what we're asking from you guys to keep giving us are these overall outcomes. So we know that it reduces office discipline referrals, it reduces suspensions, and we know we have a reduction in restraints and seclusion when we're using school-wide PBS. We also have improved teacher outcomes and staff and administrator, which I think is also really important for us to think, because this really is a whole school type of approach. It's not just the students or behavior, it's also what are the overall school aspects of it. We know we have better school climate, we have better school organizational health, we have better perceptions of efficacy of teachers, which means that they have more confidence in their ability to teach when they're in school-wide PBS schools. And then we also have, and this is really kind of neat because this has been around for like 10 years, this a perception of better increased school safety, which we know in Florida is a big deal, and nationally it's a big deal. And we've kind of been looking at that for 10 years on whether or not schools feel more safe when they have school-wide PBIS, and we do know that they do. Can you switch slides? We also wanted to give you a little snapshot of our Florida data, because I think it's really relevant about the schools that you guys are working in. Do we have outcomes? And these are really strong studies. You'll notice that the citation on the bottom includes some people that you probably have met: Karen, who's our data person, Heather George, and Don Kincaid. And then we also have some really good University of Florida data people that have been involved with us for a while. So this is on discipline. We looked at the effect of school-wide PBIS on discipline. We matched 593 schools in Florida with schools that were doing school-wide PBIS with fidelity, with schools with no training. And when you match it, you kind of like trying to match a school that would be similar to the same school, maybe demographics or like rural with rural, just to make sure that you can't say, well, there's some other factor of why they're doing better. So they're matched. The results were that they had fewer out-of-school suspensions for students with disabilities and African-American students within the schools implementing with fidelity, which I mean is huge, because we're not just talking about, we know that it's been reducing out-of-school suspensions, but now we're seeing that on top of that, it's better for students with disabilities and African-American students. And if you're implementing with fidelity for 3 to 5 years, you have the greatest decreases in the out-of-school suspension. Can you go to the next slide? And in academics, they looked at academic outcomes. They looked at 2,033 elementary schools in Florida that were using that FCAT from 2003 to 2014, and about 235 schools within that were implementing school-wide PBIS with fidelity that they could actually use in their data sample. And they found that students, schools implementing with fidelity had more students at or above grade level benchmarks for math and reading. So this is Florida data. This is the schools that you guys are in. We're having better impact on academics. Can you, thank you. And then finally, just to remind you about fidelity, kind of when we hound you guys to try to get the, whatever fidelity we're looking at, TFI or BOQ, that it really does make a difference. You'll notice that we kept mentioning the importance of fidelity, that schools who are doing it really well are getting better outcomes. This specifically looked at BOQ data, and they looked at 1,122 schools in Florida across all levels for a bunch of years. And they found that schools with higher BOQ total scores had lower office discipline referrals, less ISS and OSS. So even, you know, better outcomes when we actually have our fidelity. Okay, next slide.
Okay, it only took me a couple slides, but I finally figured out how to get the slides to advance. Oh, and now I'm like going crazy with it. Sorry about that. Well, I, in addition to getting to host these awesome technical assistance chats, I work with district coordinators, and as Laura was saying, we examine that data with districts a lot in terms of comparing schools that have high and low implementation fidelity. And what we see, you know, boots on the ground, is more often than not, the schools that have high fidelity, meaning they're really working their PBIS, doing as many of the critical elements as possible, those are the schools that typically have lower rates of referrals. And it's a pattern that we see again and again. So I think we see this evidence. We know that PBIS works, but that question still remains. So why aren't we all using it? Why do we have this lack of buy-in for it? And why can't we just show all of this awesome data and, you know, have all hands on deck and everybody excited and enthusiastic to begin? And I think that's, you know, part of what we're trying to do with you guys today is we're going to show you the facts, we're going to show you the research, and we're also balancing that science with our knowledge that buy-in is more than the facts. It's understanding where people are coming from in terms of their beliefs and their perceptions, and really building relationships with our stakeholders to know what they're looking for. So we wanted to just get a little bit of response from you guys. In the chat, if you wouldn't mind, tell us some of the things that you get asked about PBIS. What are parents asking? What are teachers asking? What are some of the questions you get asked? And then also, what are some of the myths or misconceptions that you often hear if you're a district coordinator from schools, or if you're in a school from others around you? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to share in the chat, and hopefully you guys can think of a couple of things that you hear about PBIS. Oh, we got at least one, so let's see. One of the myths: all we do is reward, no consequences. Oh, a similar one: PBIS doesn't have consequences. Only the bad kids are being rewarded. And then Deanne Meyer said we're bribing kids. We've got, oh, it's only for the bad kids, so another one. Teachers are not allowed to write discipline referrals. Some people ask, why are we rewarding extrinsic motivation? Doesn't increase intrinsic motivation. Kids should just behave, just because. I don't need to give them something for doing what they're supposed to be doing already. Hug a Thug program. I'm guessing that's like along the lines of rewarding kids that have quote unquote bad behavior. Yes, okay. Okay, let's see, I'll give it another second, but I definitely saw lots of patterns in terms of responses, the things that we hear. And I think we tried to come up with the ones that we thought would be most relatable. And I think we did a good job based on what you guys said. And then just one more: typically it's the student that doesn't deserve a reward because of all the bad choices made. Okay. Oh, here's another one. Sometimes people have the misconception that it takes too much time, but in the long run, it saves so much quality instructional time. And I'm glad that you said that. We are going to kind of point in the direction of some of that research too about instructional time gained. And so we'll definitely get there. Thank you guys so much for responding. And that validates for us that I think we're on the right page with the ones that we came up with. All right, so I'm going to show you this video, and in watching it, I just kind of want you to think about the stakeholders, and this may sound familiar to you.
So, Dottie, just remember, anxiety about change is really just a fear of losing control.
Oh, but Dr. Bond, that's just it. I have no control. None. Not an ounce of it. I've been in elementary education for 23 years, and I've seen open classrooms and back to basics, whole language, hooked on phonics, higher standards, no standards. You do your thing, guys. Don't do that thing. Assertive discipline, no discipline, student-based education, outcome-based education, mastery learning, master teachers, merit grades, mentoring programs, peer coaching. I've done it all.
So I think we've all experienced, and she looks just like this teacher I had when I was a kid that I absolutely loved. This very, very kind woman. So much passion, so much energy, but we know that she probably feels like she's wearing so many hats, and there's always a new initiative coming down the pike. And if you're around long enough, you see so many of them. But we have to listen to that. We have to listen to what she's saying, because, you know, we want people to understand that PBIS isn't just a new initiative coming down the pike. So we really need to connect with our stakeholders and figure out what is it that we all want to see? What's that connection that we all want to see, and building those relationships so that we all have a say and a voice in how we create our PBIS framework. What you're going to see today are a couple of the myths, and these should look familiar based on the chat. The first one we're going to address is what PBIS is and what PBIS is not. We're also going to look at the use of rewards, the use of punishment, lack of time, and lack of money. So those are some of the key issues that we'll be talking about today in terms of myths and misconceptions. We'll also be kind of giving our response that we would tend to give in these situations, and some of the research that those responses are grounded in. And I just want to let you guys know that in the chat pod, there are references for many of the citations that you're hearing today, and we'll also give you a couple of other kind of little pieces of information and handouts that might be helpful for you. But you can just download what you want and leave what you don't want. It's all there for you. So in terms of misconceptions about PBIS, some of the things we hear is that it's just another program. You know, it's just something you take out of a box and install, and, you know, you have to buy a new one every couple of years. The other one is that it's just those expectations and rewards. PBIS and rewards, for some reason, that's the one salient feature that really has come across. But those of us who know PBIS know that it's so much bigger than that. And then the last one we have here is that we have to eliminate our other initiatives if we use PBIS. So we're going to talk a little bit about those. You know, a lot of times there's a misconception that we're doing PBIS if we have our posters up and we're giving out our dragon dollars or our token economy at our events. And while those are really good features to have, that's not all there is to it. So most of you listening today, I think, have a background in PBIS. So you probably know that PBIS is a framework. It's a multi-tiered approach to building this comprehensive model, and it's rooted in research from fields like applied behavior analysis, community health, systems theory. It's grounded in all sorts of research. And the key feature is that it is a framework. It's not a packaged program or curriculum. And what you see here are a couple of key studies that PBIS researchers have gathered to show how all of the elements together work to create this framework. So on this slide, this kind of summarizes all of the information we've shared so far about what PBIS is. You know, it's an evidence-based, three-tiered framework, and we use it to integrate our data, our practices, and the systematic approach that we take into this nice triangle format so that it allows us to do things for everybody at tier 1 that are all uniform practices that we use problem solving to help create. Then it helps us to identify what some need, so that tier 2 level of support. And then at the very top, what we need to do for students that have those intensive needs in terms of behavioral intervention. So all of these things together help us to provide support for everyone. And so this is another visual of the triangle. And what this illustrates, and I think it's really important because sometimes I see, you know, schools put out a triangle and then they have like little interventions in each of the colors. I don't know if you guys have seen that before. And sometimes I'll see PBIS listed in the triangle. And I think to myself, well, that in itself is a misconception because PBIS really is the triangle. The interventions that you plug in are really because of the planning that you do as part of your framework. You design what interventions are most appropriate or what curriculums are most appropriate based on your PBIS framework. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. And another response, it's not likely that you're going to need to replace interventions or curriculum that you're currently using in order to adopt a PBIS framework. That might happen, but it's really a result of the problem solving that you do within your PBIS. What PBIS will help you to do is to examine those existing programs that you have to see if they're really what your students need. So if you have something like Second Step and you're utilizing that and it's being successful, then you're going to keep on using it. But if you're needing as a PBIS team to look at the data and for whatever reason Second Step doesn't seem to be an intervention that's meeting the needs of your students, that decision making is all part of that framework. And I'm going to hand it over to Laura. She's going to take us through some of these other examples.
We just wanted to give a couple of examples of some ones that you might have, you know, social skills in general, check in, check out, check and connect. These are all strong tier 2 examples. You want to go to the next slide. And then for tier 3, we have a lot of research. This is just one of them on using functional behavior assessments. And then we have a bunch of studies on prevent, teach, reinforce, which is something that Rose within our project works with districts on, that has a strong base for this tier 3 level intervention. These are just really snippets of a whole bunch of research out there on that. We provided some handouts for you guys, and in those, there's a whole laundry list on the one from Horner that has a whole bunch of different interventions that you might be using that do have evidence base behind them. The reason why we wanted to highlight this is that the framework provides a structure that really works well for braiding in different initiatives if they're needed within your school. So if the data in your school suggests you need something for tier 2, and check out is a good one, that is good to put in place. The important thing to know though is that the intervention is only as good if it will work. So it's not just that you have a laundry list of interventions in the school and you're going to put it in the framework. Are you using ones that you know will work, that are solid curriculum, solid interventions, and putting them within the framework? Because otherwise you might say PBIS is not working, but it could be that the interventions you're putting into the framework that would support those interventions are the interventions not solid. So that's just something to think about. I've been doing some coding of the mental health plans for Florida, and we have been looking at what the districts are listing for evidence-based interventions, and they're all over the place. They're really spanning from, you know, we found it on a website and put it in, to really strong interventions. So again, I just wanted to mention that really look at what you're using before you just put it in the framework. Does your data suggest you need it? Is it an effective intervention? And then finally, is it working for the kids that you have using it? Just because we have an intervention that works, will it work within your school for your particular kids? So again, that whole problem-solving approach, that is supported by the framework. We can bring stuff in, but we want to do it mindfully, so we're not just throwing every single thing into our framework. The other misconception that we hear a lot, shifting, is on rewards. So rewards don't work, they're bribes, and that they weaken and damage the development of intrinsic motivation. So overall, there's a big, solid research, and we included some of it within the handouts on the idea of positive reinforcements and rewards, etc., working. So here's just a couple of a snapshot, and some of this is probably really familiar, but it does give you a couple of talking points to think about. In terms of like rewards, instead of thinking of them as, you know, the counters, the tickets that you're handing out to the students, think of them as those tickets are more the symbols of what you're doing with your students. When we give the student an academic paper, you know, we provide some sort of feedback. It might be a grade, it might be a check, whatever. We're saying you've met the criteria, you're doing really well, here's the response. We're providing teaching of this academic. We kind of have to think of behavior the same way, and that our rewards are kind of like how we're saying to the student, you're meeting your marks, you're doing the appropriate behavior, and it serves as a teaching tool. So those coupons can remind the staff to make sure that they are rewarding the behavior, but it's a behavior itself that we really want to look at and really say, wow, we've caught it, you're doing a great job. It makes appropriate behavior more likely to occur, so we can catch students being good, which is great, rather than always kind of coming in last minute when we have that chaos in our classes or our assemblies. Creates behavior momentum, which means that once you start sort of having like positive behaviors within our schools, it kind of catches on. So you kind of know when you go into a PBIS school that's working really well, that you have that school climate that is really strong, and that builds upon itself. We have that positive student-teacher relationships and school climate. We'll talk about school climate a little bit later. It can counteract negative peer influences. So if you have students that are modeling really great behavior for other students that might not know those behaviors or might behave inappropriately, and you're giving lots of attention and reinforcement for those appropriate behaviors, those students are learning from their peers what it means to have appropriate behavior, and they're seeing their peers getting attention for that. It's more likely that they're going to go for that more appropriate behavior to get that attention, instead of getting attention for inappropriate behavior. So it kind of shifts the focus. And then also it increases that intrinsic motivation. I see we have somebody in the chat. Betsy, can you tell me what we got?
Yeah, I think his name is Jared. He is from Texas, and his comment was about secondary campuses, and we see this all the time. Secondary campuses' response to the idea of a reinforcement system as being something really elementary, because high schoolers should know how to behave, or middle schoolers should know how to behave.
And I would address that. I would say that they have done some research in high school levels, and they found that it's kind of preliminary research because high school is kind of a new area for research, but that one of the biggest predictors of success within PBIS is that even at high schools that they're teaching the kids the better behaviors. They might do it differently. They might have maybe the students more involved. Maybe the students are videotaping skits on how to behave, etc. But that it still works at the high school level. You just have to tweak it to make it more developmentally appropriate. But that is something that they have heard, and they are working on that at the national level for some of the high school settings, that it's a little bit different in those high schools. Can you change the slide?
Oh, sure. Thank you for sharing that. I think that resonates with a lot of people. I don't know why it's so hard for me to do this sometimes. Okay, there we go.
Go back to the next one, because the prior one. All right, so this is the bribery one, and one more slide before. Betsy, there we go. All right, so
okay, sorry about that.
We hear that reward systems are bribing students, and this one's a little challenging. I mean, I think even if you look at what's been going around nationally, we have a difficult time to figure out what is a bribe and what is not a bribe. What we're saying in PBIS is that if we set up these expectations and rules, and the students know that they're going to earn the better rewards, it's not a payoff for good behavior, but these are the expectations. They follow the expectations, they're going to get reinforced for that. That's different than a bribe, which is more of like you're saying, well, please do this, and then we will give you this behavior, and it's more in that moment. So the goal is to try to set up that expectations ahead of time. Yep, and we also have a really good comment that also bribes do involve that illegal behavior, and rewards highlight the good choices. So again, that's sort of like, let's look at, we're really trying to set it up that we are really saying, here's what we really want the students to do. And once they do that and they meet that mark, then we're giving those rewards rather than trying to coerce them and start that kind of cycle with the students. Next slide. We also know, in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, that back in 2001, there was an extensive review by Cameron, Banco, and Pierce. I think it's like 60 pages. It was so long that I looked at it, I put it in a folder, and I was like, someday I will read this. But the overall takeaway was, when they did a review of all the research out there in the 2000s, that external rewards, there's no evidence that external rewards are detrimental to intrinsic motivation. They had another study in '94, going back even further, that for high interest tasks, verbal rewards are found to increase free choice and task interest. And in that 2001 review, that when tasks are of low initial interest, rewards increase free choice and intrinsic motivation. So we do have research going back 20 years from even like when PBIS was really starting, that we don't reduce intrinsic motivation when we reward students. We also have the idea that rewards are not just tickets. So I think about this this book. I'm sure you guys know, The Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and my son was really into it a couple years ago, and I got really excited because there was a scene within it. I can't remember which the main figure is. I remember his stick figure, but I cannot remember his name. But his school had, quote, done PBIS. They didn't call it PBIS, but they basically had a bunch of rewards, and he had figured out how to counterfeit the rewards. And he was, making them, and he was going to bring them into the school, etc. So I was so excited that we hit this book, like, Wimpy Kid, all these kids are reading this is great. So I showed it to George, the guy who was all excited, and he was so disappointed. He's like, but that's not what PBIS is. It's more than just the rewards. And he is so right, because it really is, again, thinking of reinforcers and rewards as a teaching tool, not just the tickets we're giving to the students, and that these tickets can prompt staff behavior, really good behavior, but it's not just giving the tickets. They can also be many things as long as they're desired by the students. So remember, we have to think about, again, this gets into the high school thing, what's developmentally appropriate for the student. So if you're in middle school, stickers might not do it anymore. And we want to think a little bit more broadly of what can be reinforcing. Can you do the next slide? So these are some examples of rewards, and just keep hitting it, Betsy, because I won't go through all of them. But we wanted to give you, again, an idea, and I know a lot of you guys know this, but rewards, again, are not just the tokens or the tchotchkes or food. They can be a student who is really struggling to do homework, that if they get a certain amount of homework done, that they get a pass. That's in a type of escape that serves as a reward. It can be social time, and especially as kids get older, more time with friends. They might have a little bit additional time at recess or lunch, or maybe after the end of class, if they have a great discussion, that they have a little bit of more free time. It can be activities. I know at, again, the high school level, I've been doing some work with high school, that students were able to earn points, and then they were able to get a free prom ticket, which is really expensive for some of the students. So that was really reinforcing to them to have that type of idea. Yep, and David Barnes has suggested that many teachers use rewards as additional opportunity to develop relationships, i.e. lunch with teacher, basketball with principal, etc. I love that idea too, that it's not just what you're doing, but also, are you building a positive school environment as you do these rewards? That's a really great point. Here's an example. This is a rural case study that looked at, they were really struggling to bring in PBIS, and they got some creative ideas that I really wanted to share with you, because I thought that these were really great, and they're all different forms of rewards. We have a principal's lunch. So once every quarter, 7 students, they have a big grade range in this rural setting, are randomly selected to have lunch with a principal. They have a birthday recognition ice cream treat. The students came up with an idea of having magnets for their lockers that said, "I'm a believer." They had an in-service day, so students led activities such as games and cupcake decoration. They had after-school activity days. This is a place that had winter, so they had a Groundhog's Day party. They had pride cards and postcards from teachers and staff to parents for exemplary behavior. That's also rewarding for a student, for many students. Star homeroom, so they really wanted to pinpoint attendance, so that each homeroom each month that had the highest attendance would get an award on the door, and the kids could wear PJs or hats to school. My guess is they differentiate a little bit based off the grade, because they have a wide grade range here. But the point is that they really sat down and got creative and said, well, we don't have the resources, we don't have these things. How can we bring some rewards together? Next slide, please. Okay, that's you.
Yes, and just so you know, we have some slides for secondary and elementary, some handouts, I mean, that give lots of free examples of rewards that you can use that won't cost a lot of money for either a secondary school or an elementary school. That information has been gathered over the years from all of our schools that put these things into place. And I really love that last example. It just sounded like a really fun place to be, you know, a place that you would feel like wanting to go to. And now I'm going to move into punishment. So there is this misconception that if we use PBIS, if we implement PBIS, then we're no longer going to be punishing students for inappropriate behavior. So that students are going to be getting away with it. And this idea that punishment serves as a teaching tool to teach kids what they should and shouldn't do, so that they will do the things we want them to. But what we typically see in terms of punishment, and especially in terms of students that have office disciplinary referrals and suspensions, is that it doesn't typically remediate the behavior or teach them the kinds of skills we want them to learn in order to make better decisions. But for some reason, it's really hard for us to move away from punishment. And I'm not really sure why that is. Well, I have kids, so clearly I do understand why that is. Because we all have that level of frustration, and you know, there's feelings that come up when there's poor behavior choices. But what I also know on both a scientific and a gut level is that punishment's not usually effective. PBIS has this reputation of being just solely focused on positive and on the idea of reinforcement. And while we value the element of reinforcement, positive actually really means so much more than that in terms of PBIS. It refers to, you know, being more proactive and teaching the kinds of things that we want students to engage in, teaching those appropriate behaviors. It's about creating a space where we all want to be, where we feel appreciated, we feel safe, we feel respected. And so our whole work is grounded in that, creating that kind of environment. So when we have people giving us information about punishment and wanting to kind of use punishment as a teaching tool, some of the responses we can come up with are that when we use punishment, we don't really see a decrease in those behaviors that we would like to see less of. If we don't see those behaviors decreasing, we know that that punishment didn't work, and sometimes it actually increases the likelihood of the behavior. It also doesn't specifically teach the students what it is that we'd like for them to do and for them to know. And a lot of times, especially in high school, those students are in these giant bodies, so it looks like they should know what to do. But in all likelihood, if they're continuing to make the same mistakes, they probably don't. So we want to make sure that, you know, we're forming these relationships and we're using those proactive strategies and reinforcement as a way to help us to teach the appropriate behaviors. One of the studies that we looked at, there's a meta-analysis that looked at 25 different studies to identify some of the key student perceptions that were shared among students who went to school in places that had less discipline issues. So what these studies found is that places that had less discipline issues, the students reported that they were more aware of the school rules, that they felt like the school rules were fair, and they felt like they had positive relationships with their teachers. So all of those things were associated with schools that had less violence. We also know that school-wide PBIS has been shown to improve the climate of the school, not just for students, but also for teachers, because we all want to work in a positive environment. We all want to learn and be in a fun, safe place to come to. And that last study, it's an interesting study that looked at inequitable discipline outcomes. So schools that had inequitable discipline outcomes, that actually impacted all of the students' perceptions of school climate, regardless of their ethnicity. So it wasn't just the kids that were receiving the most discipline referrals that felt like the school wasn't a great place to be. A good majority of the students felt like the school was not a great place to be based on that data. And going back to the idea that PBIS ignores inappropriate behavior, it doesn't ignore inappropriate behavior. It helps us to think about and to plan for a whole continuum of consequences. So what we're doing is creating a predictable system for how we can first prevent and teach and reinforce the behaviors that we want to see, but it also includes those consequences for situationally inappropriate behaviors. We're not ignoring those things. We're just trying to create a system that is predictable so that we're consistently implementing the same kinds of consequences. And these are two examples of studies that include addressing behavior as one of the key components of PBIS. So you can actually see that it's grounded in the research to talk about those things, to talk about discipline and behavior. And Laura is gonna tell us a little bit about misconceptions having to do with time.
So a big one, and we saw this in the group chat, is that we don't have time to do PBIS. Go next slide. So our response is that when you use a preventive approach, rather than always having to deal with problem kids or problem situations, that we can focus more on our instructional time, which is, you know, why we want to be in school, whether it's building relationships or doing academics. That if we teach those school-wide behaviors and appropriate behaviors, it's not time consuming. A lot of times it does take a little time up front to get it started, but then we can have those lesson plans in place. We can have it as part of the orientation for the school year or for new teachers. And then we really do more problem, when we see problem behaviors, we can do some reteaching, which again saves us time than always having to reprimand for that problem behavior. We also know that the skills that we are teaching are often prerequisites to instructional behaviors that we need for teaching, especially as the kids are getting older, which is that peer collaboration, debating, cooperative learning, sharing, turn taking, and things we need to succeed as adults. That these behaviors of listening, etc., and the social skills are actually really important academically to teach these as behaviors. Next slide. They do also say there's a lot of studies on classroom management, and this specific one looked at time. It was across 65 elementary schools, and I don't think it was Florida, but it does have Florida researchers involved with it. It was on active instruction, teaching, opportunities to respond and feedback, and they found that students with low rates of classroom management were less engaged in class instruction, which then suggests that if you have high classroom management, you're going to be more engaged in the classroom. And again, classroom management is part of that how are we addressing our PBIS within our classroom structures. Next slide. We also have a study that really dug deep into a school, and again, it's just one study, but I think it's really strong. It was published in Journal of Positive Behavior Intervention Supports, so our sort of like big journal, and it really looked at different types of time saved. It looked at administrative. So we think about how much time the administrators have to take dealing with behaviors. How much does that mean? Well, in this one school, they had a baseline, and then they had their year 1 and year 2. Baseline would have had nothing for administrator time because they don't know how many days saved. There wouldn't have been. They were days lost. For year 1, they saved about 15 days for administrators, and in year 2, about 17 days. And that's pretty fast from a baseline to get to those days saved. Instructional time, they figured because of suspensions, they saved about 50 days. Their baseline, they were spending 462 hours for suspension. Year 1 dropped to 192. Year 2 dropped to 132. And for ODRs, the average time saved was about 30 days. Baseline, you could look at those number of minutes, over 12,000 minutes. Year 1, look at that drop to 2,000 minutes, and year 2, 920 minutes. So again, this is real data looking at instructional time and impact of time and what school-wide PBIS was able to save this one school. Another study looked at instructional days lost, and it looked across time, but I pulled 2 snippets from the start of the study and the end of the study on instructional days lost. This is an elementary school implementing PBIS, and they were losing 89.5 days in the beginning, and they dropped that by, I'm not gonna do the math, about half, 43 days in a couple of years, and saved all of that time to be able to do the instruction. The other misconception that goes along with that time is that we don't have money to do PBIS. So again, we talked about this multiple times. Positive feedback is very effective. It's free and low cost, and often we can use reinforcers that are. We have got examples here of low cost reinforcement that are also in your handouts. And then also that it's not, we have to talk to our students about what motivates them. We kind of assume that it's high ticket items, but often if we have discussions with the students, that it's not really those big bikes that they're wanting. They might be totally happy with having a little free time in recess, a little bit more time in the day. It might be more reinforcing and available to many more students than a high ticket item. Next slide. We have funding, rewards, and ideas. Some of you guys might know of all of these things, but schools might have improvement funds. Sometimes they're federal, sometimes state funds that they can access for this type of positive behavior. We can involve our parents with our PTOs, ask them for help in certain initiatives. We might have community partnerships. There might be something going on in the community, especially in our rural areas, where we can really tap in and say, hey, can you work with us on this? We might have fundraisers. There are grants. I know that some of you have gotten school climate grants, which are more federal, but there's also sometimes local grants that are even maybe in your district that you might be able to tap into. There's educational websites, how to get free resources, and then also, again, that free and low cost activities rather than always thinking about what do we need to buy for our reinforcers. Next slide. And again, this is that rural case study I had mentioned before, where we had that whole laundry list of really awesome activities that they were providing. And I wanted to take a little even closer look at that when we think about costs and supplies. So that principal's lunch, they needed food. The principal and staff donated the food. And I know that's a lot to ask for our principal and staff, but it's just, again, like, what resources do we have in our school that people might contribute? Or the birthday party recognition, they asked for PTO funding for that. For the student in service day, they had items in the school already, and then the parents donated the food, the cupcakes to decorate. They had an anti-bullying awareness prevention, so it was a PD that worked well with their PBIS. It was offered by the Boosters Club and their Sheriff's Department. It was a training community sponsored, so there were no costs to the school, and it helped build that community bridge, especially, again, in the rural settings. And finally, that STAR homeroom, the school had those supplies, and there's no cost to having students wear PJs or hats to school for one day. So just, again, thinking of costs of rewards, what can we use that we already have within our schools, or we can try to get donations, not just from teachers and staff, but also from our community. And then finally, an impact on study. That same study looked, and again, this is from, it's a little dated, it's 99 to 2001, so I'm sure there's inflation involved here. But when they looked at the actual costs, they took the time that the administrators were spending and they put that into some, whatever statistics they used to actually determine the cost. And in year one, they saved about $6,000 of administrator salary, and in year two, about the same, a little bit more. And in their instructional costs, about $3,000 was saved. And again, this is going back into the 2000s. So I'm assuming that some of these costs would be even greater if they looked at the same school again. Next slide.
Hey. Wow, we made it towards the end of our presentation. We just got a little bit more. But that was a whole lot of research and information around some of the topics that we hear most often as being some of those myths and misconceptions. And hopefully you've got some information that you can share, or some things that you could put in your tool belt from some of those studies that we shared. But we also wanted to address the idea of how we can not only encourage you to learn about the research, but also look at the approach that we use for sharing all of this information with folks. Because we know that sometimes just giving the facts doesn't always work. So we can show the research. Another way for us to obtain buy-in is to demonstrate that things work. So as we start to bring people on board and they use PBIS, and they can kind of show through their own classroom practices that things are working, that can be a really great solution for getting buy-in. And then also this idea of addressing beliefs, attitudes, and motivations. So just really having a clear understanding of where people are coming from, and that whole idea of just listening, really listening to some of the ways that things are are said. So here's a little deconstruction of some of these myths. And the first one is that myth that PBIS is just another program. So we could just kind of talk about what we know about PBIS and how it's a framework, but we might want to know a little bit more about where that person's coming from. So in that sentence, PBIS is just another program. There could be multiple motivations as to why they're saying that to us. It could be frustration that just another program, meaning we've been implementing so many initiatives and I'm inundated and I'm overwhelmed. It also could be that they've experienced inconsistencies, that a lot of programs have been tried and there hasn't been fidelity around them. So some of the underlying questions behind what they're saying, maybe they're asking, is it another program? How is this going to be different from the other things that we've tried here? Another myth is you shouldn't reward kids for doing what they should be doing already. And so if we were to deconstruct that, somebody saying that, we might see a possible motivation that, you know, I've heard bad things about using rewards. My own background of experiences or, you know, the way I was raised didn't advocate for the use of rewards. So we might want to know more about what their reservations are around that use of rewards. Really, you know, asking some questions and listening to what's at the root of some of these, you know, issues that people might have. Another strategy is in terms of how we respond when somebody says something like, we shouldn't be rewarding kids for what they should be doing anyway. So we can come at this from the angle of a rebuttal, which would be something like a statement of facts. You know, well, rewards are effective in changing student behavior. We've got lots of research. Let me give you all my handouts. So that's one strategy. But for many people, we want to maybe dissect it a little bit and start asking some questions about, well, if we feel like we shouldn't reward kids for what they should be doing, what is it that we feel like they should be doing? How do we know, how can we let students know that they're on the right track with their behavior? You know, how do we let kids know they're on the right track when they're in math? You know, what are some strategies that we use to give them feedback? So, you know, it's kind of more of a leaning them in the right direction and asking questions to really dissect what the issue is. So here's another one, a perceived problem. There's two different ways to looking at it, right? So the first one says our students aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're tardy, they come to class without their materials, they don't turn in their homework. So we could look at that and we could do something where we put the focus on the student, and this is the student problem. Or we can reframe that problem and talk about what are some of the things that kids need to learn in order for this to not be a problem. One is that maybe they don't know what the expectations are. Maybe the expectations and procedures aren't the same in every classroom. You know, maybe their kids have a preference to do something else. So maybe this isn't engaging enough. You know, maybe the kids just don't feel connected to school. That's why they're not coming on time. So thinking about things from a different frame so that we can work with things that we have the ability to change, because we don't have the ability to change that, you know, this perception that, you know, these are the bad kids. But if we look at what the behavior is, something like not following the procedures or expectations and then working on teaching those things, well, that's something we have a lot of control over. Another reframing strategy might be something like with the idea that PBIS costs too much to implement. So rather than just having a disagreement over this, we can start to think about really breaking down the cost. And Laura did a really good job of taking all of those different, you know, rewards initiatives and looking at, well, how much would they really cost? What would the cost involve? And working together with our stakeholders to think about the most important features of our PBIS, brainstorm the resources that we already have on campus, go through some of those old broom closets and linen closets and behind the stage, and to see what we've already got within our capacity to use. All right. right, we're running low on time, so I'm gonna just kind of go through a couple of these. This one is removing constraints. So this idea that somebody may state, we need to be tough with discipline to make sure kids are safe. Well, we can really dissect that sentence and unpack it a lot, right? We need to be tough with discipline to make sure kids are safe. Well, one of the things that we can really see in this sentence is that safety is really important to us, or the person that's talking about this. So keeping the focus on keeping kids safe, and so thinking about the things that are keeping kids from being safe, and start to brainstorm that list of ideas. So moving away from the idea that discipline is the answer to really thinking and unpacking the safety issues that might be going on, so that we can really start to identify how to find a solution to the problem. And so here's another one. What are the barriers to staff identifying the most effective strategies? So some of the barriers, some of the things that we might come up with as making a more unsafe environment, rather than it being this lack of discipline, one of the things might be the climate. The students don't feel connected to the school. Maybe it's that we don't have enough supervision in certain areas, and there's a lot of fights and unsafe situations happening in those areas where there's not that supervision. Or there also could be this really intense focus on a few students without looking at the overall school functioning. So all of those could also be contributing to school safety. But if we're only focusing on the need to be tough on discipline, we might miss all these other kind of barriers that exist that we really have some control over in order to improve. So I love this quote, and I think it's great when we're thinking about buy-in and all of this research and trying to, unpack all of this. We don't have to, Rome wasn't built in a day, and we can take these pieces of information and figure out the ones that are most meaningful to us, or most problematic, the biggest barrier. We can make a few changes, a few adjustments, and those changes can have a really large difference. So it doesn't have to be revolutionary to be transformative. And so I hope you guys picked up a couple of little nuggets of inspiration that maybe aren't revolutionary, but could help you guys to have some transformation. And so I think with that, we just have one more poll that I hope you will engage with us on, and I'm going to try to pull it up. And that was, how helpful was today's chat? So I'm going to launch that poll for you. And if you wouldn't mind just sharing with us how you felt about today's chat. And this helps us to build our content for next year and years to come. We want to make sure we're doing things that you guys enjoy. And the last piece also is we have all of our chats archived. So you can definitely go to our website, and in the middle of the screen, you'll find a TA chat schedule. And from there, it will, sorry, I'm just going to end our polling. It will show you what chats are available. So this chat will be up for you to be able to see within the next couple of days. And so I will make sure to get it up there for you. And our next chat actually isn't until April, where we're going to be talking about the model school application. So definitely check that one out if you're applying for model school or you have schools that are applying. It will be most helpful. And lastly, this is our contact information. And I'm going to go ahead and go into the chat. And Laura, did you have anything else that you wanted to share?
No, just I appreciate the opportunity for Betsy and I to share some of this with you guys. So thanks for hanging in there.
Yes, thank you. You guys have a great afternoon.